Hey, y'all. We just wanted to get on the mic before we put the music drop on to let you know that this next episode is on fire. It's got some hot takes in it.
Boy.
And it's going to be crazy. So just know that we had our interviewee in and we just kind of let him talk. And it's a two-part discussion, and then our third episode with this series, we will unpack this from a colored commentary perspective. So don't operate any heavy machinery as you listen to this thing, and be ready because colored commentary is here. Well, hello out there in listening land. How you doing? My name is Marcus Lloyd, your host here at Colored Commentary. Colorful conversations by colorful people about Christianity, culture, and race. And with me in the studio, as always, is Mr. Antoine Malone.
What's up, everybody? How y'all doing this morning and this afternoon and whatever
and wherever time, they're listening to this
whatever
thing
time
right
you're
now.
Listening. So glad to be with y'all this morning.
Yeah, it's going to be good, man.
Today's going to be a good time.
I'm excited. I don't want to get, look, I know we like to do a little early banter and get in that, but I want to get right into this, right?
I say let's jump on in, man.
Yeah, because this is going to be a fun show. We have a very special guest on the show with us today. It's someone who we were introduced to, I guess, been about a year ago.
Yeah.
And just hearing the things that he had to say and reading some of the things that he's written, it's just really impacted us in the conversation around race, unity, justice, and reconciliation. And so we have on the show, we have a presidential candidate.
Yes,
running on the independent platform. We have Mr. Mark Charles. How you doing out there, Mark?
Well, hey, thank you very much. It's good to be on the show with you.
Man, we're so glad to have you on the show. You've got a new book that you put out, Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanization legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. And I know you wrote that as well with, should I call him pastor? How do we refer to Mr. Soong-Chan Rah?
Yeah, Dr. Soong-Chan Rah. He's been a pastor. He's not a pastor now. Yeah.
Okay.
So he's a professor at North Park Seminary.
And we love him as well.
I just call him Soong-Chan.
You just got a first name. You're like, I don't even know what to call him these days.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I've seen him so many times at different conferences as well. And so when I saw that you two had teamed up for a book, I was like, I got to get this book.
I gotta do it. Yeah,
now,
especially after listening to the podcast. I think I listened to that podcast 4 times.
Yeah, just trying to get it
by
off
myself. And then I was like, hey, babe, why don't you listen to this with me? We need to.
And you're not talking about me when you say babe. You're talking about your wife. Let's just be very
about
clear.
My wife, yeah.
For anybody
talking
who's
about
listening.
Lisa, my lovely. Shout out to the lovely Lisa out there.
That's right. Well, Mark, man, okay, so help our audience understand. You know, obviously we are very familiar with you, but your work may not be as familiar to our audience. So you can tell us a little bit about your background and your work so that our listeners can understand a bit more about the lens through which you are seeing the world.
Yeah, so please let me just introduce myself more traditionally. So Mark Charles Yunish, yeah. Sin B'Kei Dene Nishli, the Tohiglini Bashichin, Sin B'Kei Dene Dashache, the Tohichitni Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. So my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and which is why I say Sin B'Kei Dene. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Sin B'Kei Dene. Then my fourth clan, my father's Tohichitni, that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also just want to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Washington, D.C., where I live with my family. And these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. It's the Piscataway Nation that lived here. They hunted here. They fished here. They raised their families here. They buried their dead here. It was their society, their nation that was here. And it was that group of people that was uprooted and removed from these lands so that the District of Columbia, the state of Maryland, the state of Virginia could be established. You are near Dallas, Texas,
right,
which is the land traditionally of the Kickapoo and the Wichita. Again, these were the nations that were removed from these lands so that Texas and the city of Dallas could be established. And I like to acknowledge the people whose land I'm on no matter where I go. this is very important for two reasons. A, we have to constantly remind ourselves against the narrative of the nation, but these lands were not discovered.
Right.
You can't discover lands already inhabited. It's called stealing. So we have to acknowledge these lands weren't discovered, and acknowledging the traditional people of the land is paramount to doing that. And second, it helps me to conduct myself with greater humility no matter where I go, remembering that there's a story to these lands that precedes what I've been taught in my history classes and I read in history books. And there's a narrative out there that I'm not nearly as familiar with as any of us should be. And so it helps me to walk more humbly wherever I travel, understanding that there's a people and there's a story that I need to acknowledge, honor, and learn more about. And so this morning I want to honor the Piscataway, the Kickapoo, and the Wichita from the lands where we're having this conversation today.
Man, that's wonderful. I appreciate that. And that's one of the things that I think I have learned from listening to you and following you is just the recognition. We talk about it a lot of times in, I think in all cultures, we go, hey, there's some shoulders we're standing on to be able to achieve the things that we're achieving. And so many times, though, the thing that gets left out of the conversation is all the way down to the earth, right, to the inhabitants of the land here, particularly in the United States. And so I've really appreciated how much work you have done in making sure that people are remembering that. It's caused me quite a bit of time to take quite not only pause to the land, but also the people who get credit for discovering that land as opposed to the people who were inhabiting it. And so, and so that's why I'd love for you to kind of help us out. I think most of us, I can't imagine that there's anybody who's listening that doesn't understand that there were people here before the United States was created, quote unquote, discovered, before the Europeans landed. They know that there were native peoples here. I think one of the things that's always struck me is, particularly because our conversation is around Christian values and Christianity as a whole, I think what struck me about your conversation is how you have helped us understand how the spreading of the gospel in some ways contributed to the discovery, quote unquote, of this land. So can you help us with that a little bit, and how do you usually frame that?
Yeah, I'll tell you two things. This may take a few minutes, but it'll really give, I think, you and your audience an understanding of where I'm coming from in this. So I was raised in the area around Gallup, New Mexico. And these were the lands that were ethnically cleansed by Abraham Lincoln during the 1860s when he established Post Redondo and then had his generals go through and literally ethnically cleanse the land of the Southwest. They removed 10,000 of our Navajo and Apache people from the lands near Gallup and between Albuquerque and Flagstaff, Arizona, and then up north to southern Utah and southern Colorado, and ethnically cleansed that whole area. And that allowed for the Transcontinental Railway to go through the land. And that's how the city of Gallup was established as a railroad town. They built a railroad through after they removed us from those lands.
So now, I
grew up in that area.
Do you mind if I get in for a second? Because you've brought in an American figure that people are who kind of raise up and memorialize and monumentize, if you will, in that you mentioned Abraham Lincoln cleansed these lands. Are you going to get into that a little bit? Is that? Yeah,
well, I mean, that's a part of this whole story, and we can definitely come back and touch on that. Cool. People need to understand that we, as a nation, don't understand who Abraham Lincoln was.
Sure.
And a huge part of his narrative is he was one of the most genocidal presidents in U.S. history, as he literally ethnically cleansed the state of Minnesota, the land where southern Wyoming and northern Colorado, and then the territory of New Mexico. He ethnically cleansed the tribes from those lands after signing the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, which allowed for the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. Mm-hmm. And three of those lines he was trying to clear the way for was the primary line, which had come to Omaha, Nebraska, and was going over towards San Francisco, but then there was a northern route that went from Duluth, Minnesota, over to Seattle, and a southern route that went through the territory of New Mexico and came out near Los Angeles. And literally within 2.5 to 3 years after signing that bill, the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, after the hanging of the Dakota 38 and
which
the
is the
nullifying of
largest,
the
isn't that the largest mass?
The largest mass execution in the history of our country.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And then after the Sand Creek Massacre and the ethnic cleansing of the Cheyenne and Arapaho from Colorado, and then after the Long Walk, where 10,000 Navajo and Mescalero Apache people were rounded up and brought down to literally what was a death camp in southern New Mexico territory, where over a quarter of our people died while in prison there. And so, yeah, so I grew up in the area of the country where that had, like, that's the history of that land. And I was attending a mission school, which was started by the Christian Reformed Church and had been established in the early 1900s as a boarding school.
What's the difference between the mission school and a boarding school?
Well, so the boarding schools were the idea of towards the late 1800s, and specifically after the a massacre at Wounded Knee, which was one of the most grotesque massacres. All of them were grotesque, but this was particularly grotesque, of the Lakota people in the Dakota territories. After that, the nation was losing some of its stomach for outright genocide, but they still wanted the land of Native peoples. And so there was an Army captain named Richard Pratt who came up with the idea of forcibly assimilating natives to Western European culture through the process of boarding schools, where Native children were literally taken from their homes, put into military-style boarding schools. They were punished for speaking their language, punished for practicing their culture. The stories of abuse, sexual, physical, mental, emotional, that happened in these boarding schools is gut-wrenching. And they operated from the late 1800s until the late 1900s. Like the school I attended had operated as a boarding school for about 80 years, and it was transitioning from a boarding school to a day school when I was there in the 1970s and 80s. So I was there as a day school student, but many other people were there as boarding school students, and oftentimes, many times, our experiences were night and day different.
Sure. Now, real quick, Mark, because you mentioned Richard Pratt, and I would love for the audience, he had a phrase that he used, right, to sort of help people transition into the thought of the boarding school?
Yeah, the goal was to kill the Indian to save the man. Again, rather than outright just committing physical genocide, let's do cultural genocide. We'll kill the Indian inside the child in an effort to save the man.
Right.
And what's interesting in his speech that he gave in 1892, justifying this process, he compares it to slavery and says, as grotesque as slavery was, it bestowed upon the Negro the greatest blessing they've ever received, which is it brought them from savagery and cannibalism in Africa to English speaking and citizenship in America. And this happened so quickly through the gift of association, by allowing them to associate with members of the higher race, i.e. their slave owners. They became English speaking and civilized. I mean, literally, it was a blatant white supremacist argument that said even slavery was a benefit to Black people because it transformed them from savages to civilized people. And he said if it happened by accident through slavery, how much quicker will it happen to natives if we forcibly assimilate them through this boarding school process?
Now, isn't part of that association too, isn't it they're being associated not only with ultimately whiteness, but Christianity at the same time? Isn't that where some of that theology mixes in?
Well, that's the problem. Yeah. So all of this goes back, and then if you look at our book, the Unsettling Truth, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery, and Sing Chan Ra and I, in the first 4 chapters, we really wrestle with how does the church get from the teachings of Jesus, who said to love your neighbor and to pray for those who persecute you, how did it get from that to a dehumanizing doctrine of discovery. Now, for those who don't know what the doctrine of discovery is, it's a series of papal bulls or edicts of the Catholic Church. They were written between 1452 and 1493. They say things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. So essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are less than human and their land is yours to take. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people because they didn't believe them to be human.
Now,
the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world and claim to have discovered it. As I said earlier, you can't discover lands already inhabited.
Right.
That's called stealing. Because we call what Columbus did discovery, it reveals the implicit racial bias, which is that native peoples, people of color, aren't fully human.
Now, real quick, so these documents, the document of discovery, which is a series of papal bull documents, right? This is historical, so people can go out and find this. Like they can look this up and read these this documentation.
Yeah, and we quote them in our book. We have references to them. The papal bull Dum Diversus is the one I was quoting to you earlier, written by Pope Nicholas V in I think that was one in 1452. But yeah, they're out there and you can read them. And so what happens is these documents, this mentality, this doctrine gets embedded into the foundations of our country. So our Declaration of Independence, which starts with the words "we the people," which starts with the words "we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal," 30 lines later refers to natives as merciless Indian savages.
Right.
Can I ask you
our Constitution,
Mark, before you go on, can I ask you to go back for just a second? So, Doctrine of Discovery, you did lay out that it gave us an opportunity, or gave those who were adhering to it the charge to go out and seize and discover, and you listed a series of verbs. Before we move past that whole area, can you just succinctly, in a sense, just say what is the doctrine of discovery? Like
it's these.
Yeah, not what it's made up of, but what was the ideology? So that our listeners who haven't heard that before can walk away with, okay, the doctrine of discovery set up this premise for us to work from.
Yeah, so the premise is that it's the church in Europe telling the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find that are not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are less than human and you can have their lands. That's essentially what the doctrine of discovery is. It dehumanized anyone who wasn't white, European, Christian, and male.
And so that comes out of, in some ways, this this ideology that there was a supreme race, and so in the midst of this supremacy, white supremacy, that you can basically do anything you want. So that's where God has a particular race that is the supreme.
Yeah, So that's what I was getting at. So that's what he was saying. But like, one would come back and say, what gives them the right to say that? You know, how could they just be like, hey, we can go anywhere and do that? What would be the cause of that? And it's that group of people will believe that because they are white and European, that somehow gives them some supremacy. Now, do you have any idea where that came from, this concept that they were supreme because they were white?
And we may not have time to go through that all in this podcast.
Okay. Sure.
I mean, I could, but I could lecture for 2 hours.
That's right. That's right.
But in the books of our chapter, I think it's especially chapters 3 and 4 in our book, we look very closely at the writings of Eusebius.
Oh, that's right.
And in his book, Ecclesiastical History, where he begins, it's this volume of 11 books, actually, Ecclesiastical History. And he begins really holding up the piety of the martyrs who were dying for their faith, and they were sharing in the suffering of Christ. But as that martyrdom, as that persecution begins to touch him, around book 8, and he begins to witness friends dying and being persecuted and even killed, and other people that he know what happens in his area in the Great Persecution in 303 AD, his mentality towards martyrdom changes. And he now begins looking for a way to end the persecution of the church. And so he actually begins propping up Constantine. And in Book 8, he declares that he's basically a God-ordained emperor of Rome. And he compares his battle at Milvain Bridge to Moses defeating Pharaoh at the Red Sea, which is one of the greatest military victories in the entire Old Testament story. And he begins to put Constantine in that role, and he begins to sell him this idea that Rome could be a Christian empire, and he could be a Christian emperor, which is a heresy because Jesus was adamant. I mean, they came to make him king numerous times. Satan offered to give him all the kingdoms of the world, and Jesus said no. The people came to make him king by force. Jesus said no. Pilate said,
right,
are you the king? And he's like, no, my kingdom's from somewhere else. If my kingdom were here, he said, my angels would come and fight for me and, get me out of here. But no, my kingdom's somewhere else. He was adamant. He did not come to establish an earthly kingdom. And so when Eusebius, in an attempt to end the persecution, creates this heresy of a Christian empire and sells it to Constantine, and Constantine bites, converts, I would say, and we show quite clearly how he most likely made up this story of this vision of seeing Christ tell him to conquer under a cross, and then converts to Christianity and makes Rome Christian. This fundamentally changed what the church was. Before that, the church was on the margins. It was being persecuted exactly as Jesus promised.
Right. And so
he told his disciples would happen. And after his conversion, now you don't become a member of the church through your discipleship or your community or your communion. Now you become a member of the church because you're a citizen of this empire.
Right.
He tells the Council of Nicaea, he moves the capital of Constantinople. I mean, he establishes Christendom. And then we look very closely at the writings of both Augustine and Aquinas, who the theologians following in the centuries following Constantine, Augustine almost immediately, and then Aquinas several centuries later. In his book on the correction of the Donatists, Augustine is wrestling with what's the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire. And he concludes that his role is to use fear, punishment, and pain to compel people to worship God, which is completely contrary to what Jesus taught. Aquinas argues that if the secular state has the authority to kill people who break man's laws, how much more authority does the church have to kill people who break God's laws? So this is, again, now that the church is in power, now it has to not just be a witness for Christ, now it has to enforce the words of Christ. And Augustine and Aquinas, rather than speaking prophetically to this heresy known as Christian empire, they decide to collude with it and do some theological gymnastics to twist the teachings, or actually to ignore the teachings of Jesus. And this is what we show in the book Ecclesiastical History, because in his book, if you're writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, a book about the history of the church, the fact that you're writing it tells you that the history has not concluded. So your book can't have a conclusion. Because the history of the church will conclude when Christ returns. So if you're writing a book about it, then obviously it hasn't happened yet. And if you have any understanding, you know you're merely writing a preface to a very long saga that is ongoing, and you're just a privilege to be a part of it.
Right.
But if you read to the final book and the final chapter of Eusebius's version of Ecclesiastical History, you will find he absolutely does have a conclusion, and his conclusion is the salvation that comes to Rome not through Christ but through Constantine. Now, he literally writes Christ out of Ecclesiastical History, because if you want to create a heresy known as Christian empire, the first thing you have to do is get rid of Christ, which is exactly what he does in his book. And he concludes it with, again, not the salvation that comes through the blood of Christ, but the salvation that comes through Constantine. And then his second book, The Life of the Blessed Constantine, is flat out heresy. And so this is the challenge. And so what we have is we have a church now, a Christian empire, that doesn't know Christ. It only knows Constantine.
And they're basing everything on the Roman culture, whatever, what it means to be
the empire,
Rome, the empire of Constantine.
So now you've got this. Now you've got this Christendom, which you guys articulate really well in the book. Just the idea of what Christendom looks like, and then that motif, if you will, plays out over years and years, and we find ourselves now to, hey, we're moving to want to go to new lands and engage the lands in some ways. And so this idea of Christian nation, empire, Christendom says we are God's empire.
The real Christian nation is the European white,
right?
Constantine.
Yeah. Okay. So that now, whenever we go, when we go to Africa, it's why you find in Gomez Zarara's writings, right? He talks about the idea of these people that they found in Africa. They did not know bread and wine, right? So it's this Eucharistic sort of connection. Now we need to introduce them to that, and this goes back to the point I think that you were even making, Mark. Is like this is that slavery that these people, these Africans, it was a privilege for them to be in our presence because now they were not only becoming quote unquote civilized, but they were being introduced to the truth of this Christian nation, which is Christ, right? So that's where that's where I imagine a lot of that doctrine of discovery kind of plays out. How is that? How is that sort of, and maybe you can just drop in on a couple of places historically from sort of the entrance of these European Christendom to the Americas. How does that doctrine of discovery sort of play out on the native peoples throughout that time?
Well, so this is, and there's one point. It actually happens in 1630. Because initially the Protestant church pushes back against the doctrine. This is a Catholic doctrine and they don't necessarily buy into it. But in 1630, John Winthrop is in what's now called the Boston Harbor. He was with a group of people to plant the Boston colony. And on board this ship, he preaches a sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity. In this sermon, he refers to the colonists that he's with as a city upon a hill. He's borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, where he tells his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining your good deeds in this dark world. John Winthrop goes on to exhort the people that in all meekness, gentleness, patience, liberality, they should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. This is your basic Christian exhortation.
Right.
But at the end of this sermon, he is trying to convince his audience that they should listen to these exhortations, and he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy 30 is the passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing at the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised lands. And in this passage, it says, "But if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey, and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river or the Jordan to possess it." Now, that's what Deuteronomy 30 says. In his sermon, while quoting it, John Winthrop changes the word river or the word Jordan to vast sea. Now, he does this because they didn't cross a river, they crossed an ocean.
Right.
So he's implying that they are standing on the banks of their promised land, ready to go and take possession of it.
Right.
And now if you read the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua, the command, God's command to Israel, what they are to do, and there's another book about the Doctrine of Discovery written by a brilliant native author. His name is Stephen Newcomb, and he wrote a book called Pagans in the Promised Land. Now, the command in Deuteronomy and Joshua of what Israel is to do with the pagans, the Canaanites in their promised land, is to literally kill them all. Leave no man, no woman, no child, no animal left alive. That's how you take possession of promised lands. Promised lands for one group of people is literally God-ordained genocide for another.
Wow.
And so this sermon, John Winthrop is is bestowing upon the colonists that they have this, they are sharing in this narrative of promised lands, which means they have the right to commit genocide. And so when you look, and in our book, we made a very conservative estimate, I think, of 8 million Native people in continental United States in 1492.
Wow.
By 1870, 5 years after Lincoln was assassinated, that number was down to 237,000.
Wow.
That is a 97% rate of genocide.
Yeah. And all
97%.
And all done and ultimately while carrying the cross, if you will, as a symbol.
It was so bad that in 1851, so just last week, right, we had the Super Bowl game.
Right.
Where we had the Kansas City Chiefs playing the San Francisco 49ers. So the Kansas City Chiefs, just like the Washington football team, use natives as a mascot, and it's very dehumanizing. It doesn't honor us. They have this despicable tomahawk chop cheer that they do. There's actually a Fox News station that was teaching the city this cheer before the Super Bowl, so everyone could cheer their team on to victory. And they have this, and so we have that on one side. We have this mascot team that's dehumanizing Native peoples.
Yeah.
On the other side, we have the San Francisco 49ers. Now, the 49ers, in 1849, gold was discovered in California. And there was a literal flood of white prospectors and settlers who rushed across the continent and settled in California to begin prospecting for gold. There were so many of them, in fact, that a lot of these 49ers found it was more lucrative to hunt natives and turn our scalps into the government for the bounties that the government was offering than it was even to pan for gold. And it was so bad that in 1851, Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of California, there were so many people that flocked to California, it actually bypassed becoming a territory and went straight to statehood. And in 1851, Peter Burnett, in his State of the State address in California, he said this, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying famine's broken out and we can't feed these people. And he's not saying disease has happened and we can't stop its spread. He's literally saying we cannot stop killing these people until they become extinct.
See, that's the fascinating part, and this is the part that I think that people need to discover and be reminded of. It's so much of what we talk about in this conversation feels like history, and we don't recognize how history plays into the everyday things that we take for granted even today. Like you just talked about, hey, we're literally watching the biggest show in the world, basically the Super Bowl, play out, and underneath all of that are these remnants of a doctrine of discovery, of manifest destiny, kind of playing itself out in that 49ers discussion, and this theology that's playing out throughout the way that America even sort of was created. And here we are in 2020, kind of cheering on one side or doing the big tomahawk chop without thinking anything of it.
We have mascots. We name our teams after both dehumanizing mascots as well as groups of people that literally were committing genocide. And this is the challenge that we're facing as a nation, is we've never dealt with our history. We mentioned earlier about Abraham Lincoln. I don't know if you've ever been to the Lincoln Memorial here in D.C.
Yes.
But there's it's the biggest monument in D.C. Massive statue of Abraham Lincoln. He is upheld as kind of the savior of America.
Right.
He's believed that he abolished slavery and that he gave rights and equality to black people. But at the base of the museum, at the base of the monument, there's a small museum. It's actually right where the bathroom is, which is how I think I found it for the first time. A lot of people don't even know
they don't even know it's there. Yeah.
A small museum.
Yeah, but there's a small museum at the base of the memorial. And if you walk down into that museum, there's these plaques about the size of a small door. And they're hanging on every wall. And they're around different themes of different parts of Abraham Lincoln's legacy. And one of the walls is a group of 5 or 6 plaques, marble plaques. The writings are etched in them, and they're about his thoughts on the Union. In the middle of this plaque, of this set of plaques is this one that says, "I would save the Union. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It's not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that."
Right.
There's a plaque hanging at the Lincoln Memorial, literally stating that according to Abraham Lincoln, black lives don't matter.
Right.
Only as it furthers the interest.
Well, now, Mark, and
it's all about the Union.
Yeah, further the interest of the Union. Yeah. So
Abraham Lincoln was a blatant white supremacist in his Lincoln Douglas debates.
Yep.
He said, and just quote this for you because it's absolutely fascinating. In the Lincoln Douglas debates, he says, I want to make sure I don't quote this incorrectly.
While you're looking for that, I think that's amazing that quote is sitting on a plaque.
Yeah,
because I've heard that quote, and I thought I'd had to go some deep place to find it because it feels like it's so hidden.
No,
and it's right in plain
sight. And it's not even lamenting it.
Not even.
It's celebrating it.
Yeah, it's memorializing.
It's celebrating it.
Monumenting it. Yeah.
In the Lincoln Douglas debates. So I was writing the book. I love to tell the story. I was writing the book. We were finishing up a section on white supremacy. And I wanted to end it with that story of Abraham Lincoln, of the plaque at the Lincoln Memorial. So I woke up one morning, and I thought, okay, I'm going to write this into this section. It will take me about an hour. I've seen that plaque. I've stood there. I've watched people go by and not even notice it. I was going to include that story to end this section on white supremacy. I'd been working on that section for probably 4 months. And so I sat down that morning before I took my daughter to school, and I thought, okay, I'll just write. It'll take me an hour, maybe an hour and a half at most. I got up early and I began writing, and I thought, well, I should include the context. And so he said this quote in response to a op-ed written by Horace Greeley, who is the editor of the New York Tribune, who wrote a scathing op-ed calling for the immediate emancipation of the slaves. Now, Abraham Lincoln already had the Emancipation Proclamation written. It was in his desk, but he was hesitant to release the Emancipation Proclamation because there were 4 states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, that had not seceded from the Union, but they allowed slavery, and he was afraid of the fallout in those states, political fallout. So instead of releasing the Emancipation Proclamation, he made this statement assuring the white slave owners in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, that he wasn't doing what he was doing because he gave a crap about black lives. He was doing this to save the Union.
Right.
And so in his op-ed, Horace Greeley mentioned something that Abraham Lincoln said in his inauguration address. In his inauguration address, Abraham Lincoln actually supported what was called the Corwin Amendment, which was the 13th Amendment that was passed by the U.S. Senate. It was never ratified, but it constitutionally protected slavery in the states where it already existed.
This was right before he got into office, right? They were trying to get this in really quick before. The morning before he was inaugurated, and in his inauguration address, he stated his support for this amendment that constitutionally protected slavery. And in making that statement, he quoted something that he said, Lincoln did, from the Lincoln Douglas debates. So I read the thing by Horace Greeley, which sent me to the inauguration address. I read that. That sent me back to the Lincoln Douglas debates. And so I'm like, I guess I got to read those. Yeah, right.
So I'm looking at the Lincoln Douglas debates from September of 1858. Abraham Lincoln is introducing himself. And this is what he says. I will say then that I am not, never have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. To applause. That I am not, never have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Abraham Lincoln was a blatant white supremacist, unapologetic.
And see, that's what's so interesting to me, Mark, is, again, these are documented, right? You didn't have to, go shake anybody down to get this, right? Like, this is stuff people can find. You were just going to be an hour.
National Park Service's website is where I got this quote.
It's all in there. And so you do something.
Wow.
You do something very interesting, though.
National Park.
That really. I don't even know how to ask you the question that'll help you move into this. But one of the things that you talk about with Abraham Lincoln that really kind of got me is not only were you talking about, obviously, the ways in which he was a white supremacist, but you talked about how the 13th Amendment, although we had the abolition of slavery, which is great, and many of us who are listening are familiar with the documentary 13th, which talks about this addendum, this line in the 13th Amendment about prisoners and the rights that they have. But you have said, and I'm not going to be able to quote it right either, but you said that not only he abolished slavery, but Abraham Lincoln created the system of the new system of slavery that we are currently in.
Yes. Yeah.
How do you articulate that?
Well, so many people, when I lay this out about Lincoln, because again, this is a Lincoln-Douglas debate. This is 1858. He became president in 1860, and then he became friends with Frederick Douglass. And so many people point to Frederick Douglass as the visible redeeming quality of Abraham Lincoln. How could he be racist? He had this black friend. Now, Susan Ra,
I think that's funny.
Actually talks about this in many of his lectures and speeches, where he says, white people tend to put people of color in one of two categories, which is either we are a threat or we're their pet.
Ooh.
And I would argue Abraham Lincoln used Frederick Douglass as his pet. And I argue that because, again, most of our country believes that we've abolished slavery. They've never read the 13th Amendment, but what it actually says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place under their jurisdiction. We've never abolished slavery. The 13th Amendment didn't make it illegal. It redefined and codified it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. And today, the United States of America incarcerates its citizens at the highest rate of any country in the world. 1 of every 5 incarcerated people in the world are in the United States. And we incarcerate our people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate that we incarcerate white people. See, because we don't understand Abraham Lincoln, you can't understand the 13th Amendment without reading and understanding the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln is arguing, and I want to make sure I bring this up correctly. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln has already stated that he believes white people are superior. In fact, he and Judge Douglas agree on that. They disagree on slavery. Judge Douglas thinks we need slavery to keep white supremacy intact. Abraham Lincoln's pretty confident we can keep white supremacy without chattel slavery. But they both believe in white supremacy. They both get laughs from the audience by suggesting that blacks might somehow be equal to whites. And they both get cheers from the audience when they blatantly uphold white supremacy. Well, they both agree in white supremacy. They disagree on slavery. Now, Judge Douglas wants to draw a distinction between the two. And so he says, well, Abraham Lincoln wants to apply the Declaration of Independence to black people. And Abraham Lincoln responds and says, well, you've never asked me that question before. Well, no, he says, I think the founders meant to include all men in the Declaration of Independence, but they did not mean that all men were equal in all respects. They did not mean they were equal in size and intellect and moral capacity. Now, he's not saying some men are taller, some men are shorter. He's talking about race. And he's saying one group is superior and one group is inferior. And then Judge Douglas accused Lincoln of wanting to make citizens of black people. Abraham Lincoln had already stated that he has no intention of making voters or jurors of Negroes or allowing them to hold office, but he plays along and says, well, you've never asked me this question directly before, so you'll never have to ask it again. I tell you, I have no intention of making citizens of black people. I think the Constitution allows states to decide that, but if the state of Illinois were to use that right, I would be opposed to them exercising it. So President Lincoln had a problem, which is he wanted to abolish slavery. He didn't believe blacks or people of color were equal. He had no intention of making citizens, and he didn't think the Declaration of Independence fully applied to us. So the problem is, what do you do with your black people, primarily, but other peoples of color? Well, you already know what to do with other people. He's committing genocide against natives. Right. What do you do with your black people if you free them from slavery, but you don't want them to be full citizens? Well, you put a clause in your amendment that keeps slavery legal in prison. So a white judge, a white jury, a white law enforcement officer can arrest them and on a whim remove their civil rights. Yes, the documentary 13 and the book does a great job of connecting the 13th Amendment to mass incarceration. But we need to connect the 13th Amendment to Lincoln. This was his brainchild.
Why do you think
he's the one who gave us the tools?
So there's going to be some people in some of our listeners who are going to, well, they're going to respond to a lot of this in interesting ways, which is good, which is great. But I'm thinking from someone who doesn't want to hear what you're saying. They may say that it's a stretch to connect Lincoln to today's incarceration issue because that feels like such a massive mastermind kind of plan that some might feel like, man, I don't know how you can take a statement like that and that be so codified and so much of a precursor to an intentional precursor to what we now see in our incarceration problem. Is there anything else that is the 13th Amendment the strongest case for connecting Lincoln to our current incarceration problem?
This is why we have the incarceration problem in the first place. Prison is the place where slavery is still legal. What happened in Philadelphia like a year and a half ago, this is how it's set up to work. In that Starbucks, there was a white Starbucks manager who didn't want black people in his store, just sitting there. Or her store, I forget if it was him or her. Mm-hmm. So they called the cops. The African-American men were not doing anything wrong. They were waiting for a meeting. They just hadn't bought coffee yet. The cops came. They had been trained in implicit racial bias. They had a black police chief. They went up to the men. They asked them to leave. The men are in a no-win situation because they can't leave. It's only been 50 years since men could sit in the same black men could sit in the same coffee shop as white people in the first place. They couldn't walk that back. They were doing nothing wrong. They had to stay there. The cops knew this. They called in their supervisors so they could observe they were doing everything by the book. They asked them a second time to leave. The men said no. There was no violence. There was no scuffle. So they arrested them, walked them out of the store. And at the end of the day, the police chief said, my officers did nothing wrong. A black police chief. And he was absolutely right. They did nothing wrong. This is how the system's supposed to work. This is what this system is about. We've never rooted out the white supremacy written into our system. The Declaration of Independence refers to natives as savages. The Constitution, if you read the entire Constitution, it never mentions women. Article 1, Section 2 specifically excludes natives. It counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. In 1787, that left white men, and technically it was only white landowning men who could vote. In 1823, we had a Supreme Court case, Johnson versus Macintosh. It's two men of European descent, two white men, European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one got the same land from the government. They want to know who owned it. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. This is the John Marshall Court, 1823. The court had to decide the principle that land titles were based on. Who had the right to sell the land, the government or the tribe? They ruled that discovery is what gives title to the land. And then they referenced the doctrine of discovery and used that to determine that even though natives were here first, but because we're less than human, we're savages, we only have the right of occupancy to the land. Like a fish would occupy water, a bird would occupy air, and Europeans have the right of discovery to the land, the fee title, so therefore they are the true title holders. That case in 1823 helps establish the legal precedent for land titles, which is now based on the doctrine of discovery. And that precedent and the doctrine of discovery get referenced by the court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005.
Wow.
I have a TEDx talk on that 2005 case. It's titled We the People, the Three Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History. And in that TEDx talk, I walk through some of the specifics of that case. I lay out how it is based on the doctrine of discovery. It actually references it in the first footnote of the case by name. It's one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime, determining that a native tribe cannot reclaim, in their own words, cannot reclaim sovereignty over embers that have already gone cold. I forget exactly how it says, but we cannot reclaim sovereignty over our lands.
Well, so in the same way,
that opinion was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Right.
So in the same way that we just like in Texas, we're expanding north. You know, as our cities get bigger, people moving here. There's lots of land going north. In the same way that we just kick out the coyotes and the skunks because we got to build an apartment building there, and those animals occupy that space, but they don't own that space. We were able to do something similar to that as we came to America, kicking out the Native Americans who lived here. But we decided
we were savages.
We decided we would build. Go ahead.
Yeah, in his 1823 Supreme Court ruling, John Marshall actually called us savages.
So now here's
the Indians who inhabited these lands were fierce savages whose only rule, he literally called us savages.
So here's the question that I think, you know, there are those who look at that even and go, okay, so you have those who are inhabiting the land, another group shows up, they battle, right? And the people who showed up want it fair and square, right? Like they just, you know, they brought their technology and were able to do, like, so what would you say to somebody who goes, hey man, and this is what you were kind of referencing before, it's like, you know, Native Americans coming back and saying, hey, we want this land that was taken from us, but some would say it wasn't taken from you, like you got to fight for it. So how would you
not the narrative our country tells. The narrative our country tells is we discovered these lands, and it doesn't own the fact that we committed genocide here. It says these were our promised lands. We had a manifest destiny.
Right.
I would be very happy if the United States, I wouldn't be happy, but I would be satisfied if the United States would just own the fact that it's a colonial and genocidal nation that ethnically cleansed an entire continent. Now, I would rather that we actually deal with our history and try to make it right. But what I am saying is we have to stop telling this lie about our history.
And that
this land was not discovered. It was inhabited.
Yeah. So you
God didn't give these lands to white people. They literally ethnically cleansed it.
What are some of the ways in which that the ethnic cleansing happened? What are, because I think people get caught up in like the word genocide, and the ways that they think about it is people would literally just go around killing everybody they saw. And I know that there were aspects of that played out. What are some of the other ways in which the genocide occurred over that time period that you mentioned earlier?
I mean, I don't know. This genocide, they went in and killed people. They early 1860s, Abraham Lincoln, one of his generals in New Mexico, he basically told his army, General Carlson gave the order to the U.S. Army to go through and literally ethnically cleanse, to shoot any Navajo they saw in sight, to round us up and take us down to Bosque Redondo, which was this death camp,
right,
that they established.
Well, and I think those are the places of
Kit
genocide.
Carson literally, he went through the territory of New Mexico. He burned our hogans. He destroyed our crops. He killed our animals. He hunted and chased our clans and people throughout the territory of New Mexico. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. And then they rounded up 10,000 who turned themselves in, and they herded us down to Bosque Redondo. And we were there imprisoned for 3 or 4 years. A quarter of our people died while in prison there.
So here's I think
this is what the country did.
Right.
This is what happened in the Trail of Tears. This is what happened in the Long Walk. This is what, when after the Dakota War of 1862, which resulted in the hanging of the Dakota 38, Abraham Lincoln nullified the treaties of all the tribes in Minnesota. They put a bounty on the tribal leaders, on the native leaders. They called up a militia, and they went through and they literally rounded up all of the native peoples and moved them out of Minnesota into the Dakota territories, put them onto a reservation that was not suitable for them to live on, and removed them out of Minnesota. In Colorado, we had the Cheyenne and Arapaho. So in the 1850s, the Cheyenne and Arapaho signed a treaty with the United States, which gave them, essentially it established eastern Colorado, western Nebraska, and southern Wyoming as their treaty lands. In the late 1850s, gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains, and tens of thousands of prospectors and settlers came in and encroached on the lands of these tribes.
So, Mark, how did...
Just a few years before Lincoln's presidency, or a few days before his presidency, they renegotiated a treaty, reducing those lands down to 1/13 the size. In 1864, the Cheyenne Arapaho were on their treaty lands, and a U.S. Army led by a Methodist pastor comes over the hill, and he orders all of them slaughtered. 150 to 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children were slaughtered, and there are reports of the soldiers parading the genitalia of the people down the streets of Denver. This is what our nation did.
So, Mark, I want to say this is sort of, in some way, tongue-in-cheek, this question I'm about to ask you, because I know that it's deeper than this. But most people are going, how did we how do we get to the places that you're talking about when at Thanksgiving we just talk about, hey, we were able to come together and have this feast with the Native Americans, and like how are we so disconnected when Thanksgiving, the way we talk about it, is the way we think about our relationship with the Native Americans, and then there's all this other history. How do we is any of that true from the Thanksgiving story?
No.
Okay.
These things are not true. These are myths created. It was actually Abraham Lincoln who created the more modern mythology of Thanksgiving in an effort to kind of unify the nation after the Civil War. And he actually was giving thanks for the fact that they were able to ethnically cleanse these lands. Like, that was one of the things he was thankful for in his proclamation, his Thanksgiving Day proclamation.
Wow.
That they had been able to clear these lands and have white people move on to them.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
So the challenge is, and one of the things I work on, and this is a theme that comes out in the book very clearly, is there's an Aboriginal leader. His name is George Erasmus, and he is from Canada. He's from the Dene people there, and he used this quote when writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened in Canada, and he said, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build a community," he said, "you have to start by creating a common memory." I love that quote because I think it gets down to the heart of our nation's problem with race, which is we do not have a common memory. We have a majority culture that remembers a mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands, broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of boarding schools and Indian massacres, of internment camps, segregation, mass incarceration, families being separated at our borders, and there's no common memory. And there's not a single point in U.S. history where you can look back and see healthy community between the races.
And you talk about that in the sense of it's not the term is not reconciliation, but you call it something else. How do you articulate that?
Yeah, so one of the things we conclude in the book is that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. But I wouldn't call ours reconciliation, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. And if you understand the history, that's a myth. There was never racial harmony here when white people arrived. And so I would call ours truth and conciliation. Conciliation is merely the mediation of a dispute. They both can lead to a healthier community, but one gives you a more honest starting point, where the other just perpetuates the myth. Things used to be great and now they're not. And so my call is that we need not a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but we need a Truth and Conciliation Commission, so that we can create this common memory and actually deal with the racism, the sexism, and the white supremacy that's been embedded into our foundations. This is one of the challenges we face as a nation, is that we do not know how to acknowledge the fact that the United States of America is racist, sexist, and white supremacist, not in spite of our foundations, but because of them.
Now, Mark,
mass incarceration exists because we've never abolished slavery. We've never abolished slavery because we've never acknowledged that people are actually equal and white people are not superior. We've never acknowledged the rights of women. Even just last week or a few weeks ago, Virginia finally passed their the ERA, but it's now too late because the ability to pass that amendment has expired. And so we've never determined that women are equal to men in our nation. This is the challenge we face.
So if we were to bullet point in a way, because we've been talking for a minute, and I think it'd be helpful.
Yeah.
We've covered so much. So maybe if we were to bullet point a timeline of sort of sort of thought map, right? So we started with the church. We get to the place where basically the connection to Christianity is to Constantine. These documents of discovery are created, which come from the Catholic Church to permit European white Christians to go and take the world in the name of Christ, discovering lands that are quote unquote discovering lands that are undiscovered, and converting whatever life they find there for the purposes of Christ, quote unquote. They go out with these lands. They go out with these initiatives. Christopher Columbus and others like him find these lands and begin their process of quote unquote Christianizing these lands by putting races in their proper harmonic order that they perceive it to be, based on some inferior and superior spectrum, right? And then we create a country around that, and we put laws in place that codify or internalize or institutionalize the ideas of this inferiority and superiority. And then we evolve as a nation in America, all of this coming from the church's sort of discovery stuff. We evolve to a place where now we've got to confront some of our previous ills, but we're exceptional, and we don't build our nation on things we do wrong. We like to celebrate what we quote unquote do right. And so we create myths, and we hide the ugly parts. And so we don't have a shared history because of that hidden space. And we're all experiencing these varying levels of injustice, perhaps is the term.
Yeah.
We're experiencing it, we feel it, we see it, but we can't solve it because we don't really understand where it came from, because we've hidden everything. So now we got to figure out, if we want to do something about it, what is the proper next step. Is that a decent summary?
Yeah, that's not a bad summary of where we're at. And one of the so that's not a bad summary of where we're at. I would agree with that.
So with that summation, we're going to take a break right here. We have, there's been a lot said thus far, and there is still more to come. So if you have been listening and you're intrigued and you want to get some more, our next episode, we will have the second part of this interview with Mark Charles. Man, it's going to be fun. Antoine, you've had fun so far, right?
I've had fun, man. I can't wait to hear some of you guys' responses to what's been said. We've got a lot to process.
That's right. Well, you know how it is. It's a colorful world out there, and you are colorful people. Open up your perspective and take in more. And as you do so, stay colored.
You have been listening to Colored Commentary, powered by Threaded, a biblical reconciliation ministry. To find out more about Threaded and Colored Commentary, go to wearethreaded.org/podcast. And to continue today's conversation, follow us on Twitter @ColoredComments.